Are we on now, yeah? Fantastic. So, first of all, thank you very, very much for kind of spending an hour with me, and hopefully I'll try and kind of not annoy everybody, which is always a challenge. So the idea for this talk was that kind of Vasco saw me speaking at another conference and said, well, you know, let's try and do something similar here. And what I normally try to do with conference organizers is annoy them by delaying my response as much as possible and giving them some generic titles so I can speak pretty much about anything. This time I am, you know, is the first time I was actually successfully beaten by a conference organizer, because Vasco got pissed off from me not replying to his emails, and then about 2 months ago just published this tweet, which kind of pretty much set me up for a challenge. So, this is the first time that somebody's announced my conference talk without even consulting me on what I'm going to speak about. And, you know, fair enough, so challenge accepted, you know. And that's why the title is so generic, and it's very, very difficult to figure out what the talk is actually going to be based on. So I think we are coming to a time where it's really, really interesting in terms of what we can do with software development in particular. And I think we are at a breaking point where all of a sudden some new really, really interesting possibilities are opening up. And I've seen some trends with other companies that I work with that I think are going to become more and more important over the next 5 to 10 years. That's what I want to talk to you about. So kind of Vasco's brief was pretty much kind of the next big change. So what I'm going to assume at this point is that everybody pretty much knows about continuous delivery, user stories, and the whole agile thing, and that we are done with that. And now the question is, what does that enable us to do next? A metaphor I've heard kind of related to this is the design of factories when electric motors became viable. And before electric motors were kind of cheap enough or possible enough to put inside factories, factories were typically built to be very, very tall. They were built based on kind of a steam boiler in the basement, and they were built tall so that the steam could go and power multiple floors at the same time. And then you'd have lots of machinery kind of working from steam. Now, when people started putting electric motors inside their factories, the first generation of those things was kind of cheaper and better. It exploded less, it cost less, but the design of the factories stayed the same. People were putting electric motors in the basements of very, very tall factories, and then it took a whole generation of kind of working with that to actually figure out that the constraint of building tall factories is no longer there. We don't need to power them by steam anymore, so we can change the way we design factories. And then people figured out that electricity kind of flows wherever you put the wires, not necessarily just up. And that there are some other constraints that are becoming important now. For example, transporting things up and down a tall factory costs a lot. And they started creating very kind of flat, but very, very wide factories where transport is cheap and electricity kind of flows. So by figuring out that the constraints that we were working with no longer apply, we were able to get a lot more out of kind of the design of factories. And I think that's the stage we are with Agile at the moment. For a lot of companies that I've worked with, this is kind of exploding a bit less than the steam engine, and is slightly cheaper than the steam engine thing, but people are still in their minds designing tall factories. What I'm going to try and challenge you today is to kind of break away from that and start designing flat factories, because the constraints of the old world no longer exist. And one of the constraints of the old world that I think is a huge challenge still for people is the cost of kind of planning and replanning and things like that. And Forrester Research published this paper about 2 years ago about how companies actually adopt Agile. They surveyed thousands and thousands of companies, and they concluded that the most popular Agile process out there by far is water, scrum, fall. That means make all the business decisions up front, then you children can go and play your Scrum as much as you want, and then when everything comes together, that's when we take it. And in a situation like that, I think that's a prime example of that tall factory thing, where kind of an organization around the software team is not really benefiting from the fact that a team can do frequent delivery. People don't want that. People want something completely different. And I think it's up to us now to kind of break that model. And that's kind of what I really want to talk about. And in a sense, kind of there's a couple of things that have gotten me kind of to think about this. One is that generally technology tends to move a lot faster than everything else these days. And our delivery capability, our programming capability, the amount of software we can produce has increased by several orders of magnitude last 15, 20 years. We have much better tools, we have much better processes, we have much better techniques. We can produce a lot more software than earlier. But I don't think that kind of we're getting, as a community, we are getting the results of that as much as we could. And that's kind of a challenge for us. It's a challenge for us to kind of sell this thing better. It's a challenge for us to actually bring other people on the journey with us as well. Kind of, a lot of the times, people I tend to work with seem to have a lot more capacity to develop than what their kind of business people actually can consume. And that's kind of a big thing now. And I said, we seem to be moving a lot faster than anybody else. And one way for us to kind of equalize that is for us to slow down, but that's stupid. The other thing is to kind of figure out how to bring everybody else on the journey as well. So kind of one of the things that is now kind of happening is really interesting, I think, is kind of this whole push towards continuous delivery and more frequent deliveries and things like that. And that's where a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges lie. And kind of Amazon is taken as a prime example of kind of things like that, where they are now shipping stuff all over the world. They are doing more and more frequent deliveries everywhere, software and physical stuff as well. So as kind of an edge case, because I travel so much, I was able to persuade Amazon US that I'm actually US resident a couple of years ago, when they introduced Amazon Prime as kind of a video streaming service. And of course, kind of they caught on to me about 6 months later, so kind of they blocked my streaming. But for a while, I was there and they thought I was an US resident. Now, a really interesting thing about that is I've traveled so much over the last year that I am legally homeless. I'm not legally resident anywhere. And kind of with something like that, getting stuff delivered is a big challenge. I wanted to buy new headphones and I had to arrange for a friend to kind of get it delivered to his home, and then he's going to meet me in Netherlands tomorrow to give it to me. It's kind of a 2-week process. Now, Amazon US thinks I'm a US resident, and not even that, because I was able to trick them to deliver something to a hotel I was staying in Manhattan. They think I live on Manhattan. So what they started to do to me is they started to piss me off really, really badly by sending me emails like, oh, we have started 1-hour delivery in your area. And I'm thinking, I said, no, mate. Kind of to get something delivered, it's a 2-week process where I need to arrange a whole set of things around it and meet somebody in Netherlands. Kind of 1-hour delivery is just pissing me off. And I think kind of in that sense, a lot of the stuff that I've seen software teams do is go around telling their companies, oh, now we can ship stuff every 20 minutes to production and things like that, completely missing the whole business process around the whole thing. And that's a big challenge for us. I think that's something that we need to start kind of resolving. So in general, kind of, there's a whole lot of obsession with speed at the moment, and most of the conference talks at kind of, especially Agile conference, about doing stuff faster, doing faster delivery, doing smaller user stories. Kind of, there's a massive obsession with speed, and when software people think about speed, they think about kind of something that's incredibly good. Kind of faster is better for us. In almost all senses, whenever you talk to software people, faster is equal to better. Now, there's a ton of examples where faster is not actually better. There's a ton of examples where too fast can actually be bad for your health. And in particular, kind of where if we start doing stuff that doesn't make sense too fast, then it just breaks a ton of other things. So, one of the things that I found quite challenging in my own work, and I'll talk about a tool that kind of I'm building at the moment and how this thing relates to kind of a couple of those cases. For me, faster kind of tended to be better until I kind of figured out that generally faster, making stuff faster only makes them faster. If we have shit requirements and we deliver them faster, that doesn't make the system any better. It just makes us spend a lot more money a lot faster. A couple of years ago, not really a couple of years ago, in 2007, 2008, I was a CTO of a company that kind of pretty much burned through about £3 million very, very quickly. We were incredibly effective as a software development team. We were burning through cash incredibly fast, and we were just delivering crap. And I think from that perspective, if we're actually slower, it would have been a lot better from a business perspective, but because we had so much capacity to deliver stuff, kind of we just spent all the money very, very quickly. And a lot of the talk that's kind of around scaling Agile in particular these days is talking about how do we scale it out to more people, how do we scale it out to kind of larger stuff, which is kind of pretty much all about how do we spend more money faster. And I think that that's one of the things we need to kind of start thinking about. And one of the biggest challenges kind of for avoiding the whole fast food thing is to figure out what we're actually delivering, what we're measuring, how we're measuring success, because I think that's completely broken. There's very, very few teams that I've worked with that have a good, clear measurement for success that would prevent us from doing fast food rather than kind of doing something else, because we just can't tell the difference. And the reason why we can't tell the difference is nothing software related. Douglas Hubbard, who wrote a book on measuring the business intangibles called How to Measure Anything, pretty much says that most businesses have no idea how to measure success. And software is just kind of a consequence of that, because most businesses have no idea how to measure success. Doug Hubbard says that generally, people tend to measure what's easy to measure, not what's important. And the proportion of kind of investment in measurement is kind of very, very clear. Stuff that's trivially easy to measure gets measured a lot, and then people focus on that. And that's where I think kind of we're in the danger of running into this whole fast food thing. Can you please close the door, because I can't kind of hear myself speaking from all the glasses. Thanks. So kind of when I look at what most teams I work with measure in terms of proving that they're doing something well, and how do we kind of communicate with the business, what do? We kind of measure stuff like this, which is completely insane. Because it's incredibly precise, it's trivially easy to measure, we can see stuff moving around and it's great, it's fantastic. You know, I can go green, I can go red, it's brilliant. But kind of Doug Hubbard says that kind of people tend to measure stuff that's trivially easy to measure rather than stuff what's important, because there's very, very rarely any idea on how to value a piece of information. Because we don't know what's valuable, we can't decide on how much money it's worth investing there. And here's a couple of models for values of information. One of the models that's really interesting for our contexts is that a piece of information is valuable in proportion to the decision it informs. So if I can make a serious decision based on something, it's a valuable piece of information. If I can't make a serious decision based on it, then kind of, it's not that valuable. Now, imagine showing something like this to somebody outside the software team. Say a business sponsor or somebody who's kind of deciding whether we're delivering something actually worthwhile, showing them something like this, the only thing they can say is like, why is this thing 28,457? Why is it not better? Kind of more. Give me more, and then kind of make it faster. And kind of, that's the problem with stuff like that. A lot of the investment we have today goes into measuring stuff like this. And because this is kind of too technical and too much data and kind of difficult to communicate to people, then we have brilliant tools like this that kind of manage that in pie charts that move around and translate this to some dollar figures that are more, understandable to business people. And this, I love this tool because kind of, for example, here it says, this team has $335,000 of technical debt. 11.6% of their system is technical debt, and they have 670 man-days of technical debt in the system. I can bet you that this system was not developed for more than 670 days, which kind of begs the question of how is it possible for us to accumulate more technical debt that we actually spent developing it, but that's okay. Now, this is another example of stuff that's kind of easy to measure, but not that useful. And kind of, a lot of people talk about this, we can use this to decide whether we go live or not go live, whether, how much stuff we need to fix. And then you go and look at a system like this, and you see that here there's 10,078 violations, out of which 8,000 are major. And at some point, somebody's going to say, yeah, but kind of still, we promised to the client we need to release this, so kind of, let's do it. So kind of, my challenge to you over the next kind of 5 to 10 years is try and figure out how to repurpose at least a part of the investment you put in measuring stuff like this. I'm not going to stop doing this, but at least a part of the investment we have in stuff like this, and then try and figure out how to measure something more important. Because all this stuff is measuring pretty much is sunk cost. Stuff we measure today in terms of test coverage, in terms of function points, in terms of story points, in terms of all that other stuff, technical debt, comments and lines of code and stuff, that's only measuring how complex something is. And pretty much the only thing you can do with us is kind of try and get it to be more complex, which is bad. I mean, a lot of people tend to perceive story points as a measurement of value. And story points are one of those kind of incredibly obsessive things that new Scrum teams are kind of going on about all the time. Whenever I visit a new Scrum team, there's kind of burn up charts, burn down charts. It's all brilliant, it's all pink, it's kind of going up and down and all fantastic. And that's no better than kind of this pie chart about tags that moves. Because all story points can tell you is how much time you've spent working on the software this week. Kind of, if you divide it by the kind of average story point per hour or something like that produced, that is effectively telling us how long a week was. Which is kind of, there's much cheaper ways of deciding that, and people have known that for a while. You don't need kind of a diagram going up and down to tell you that. And then again, the question is, if we focus purely on that, then we get into this whole kind of problematic discussion around scaling and what we aim for. And I think there's a whole kind of messed up concept of success in our industry these days, where kind of, especially if you look at kind of the job boards and things like that, people are boasting how big the projects are that they delivered. And that's typically measured in kind of, oh, you know, this was 3 million, 5 million, 6 million, and things like that. And, you know, I've done it on time and budget. As a team, we've done it on time and budget and things like that. So time and budget is a really, really interesting thing because people seem to be proud these days that, the fact that they're doing Agile allows them to do stuff on time and budget. Time and budget is pretty much saying we've not failed. I've not killed myself this week. Brilliant. That's a success, yeah? So, and I think that's pretty much the minimum baseline we should be kind of, there shouldn't be challenged at all. Why are we still talking about that? That's kind of the tall factory versus a wide factory thing. The boiler is no longer exploding. Brilliant. Now let's figure out what we can actually do with that. And that's part of the challenge for us as a community. So the other thing that's really, really problematic is kind of this measurement of success and scale and things like that. And there's a lot of talk about SAFe and scaling to more people and scaling to larger budgets and things like that. And I had this completely bizarre meeting with one of the kind of relatively senior people at a bank in London a couple of years ago. They wanted to kind of, this bank has been trialing Agile with lots of smaller teams, and now somebody serious from the business finally woke up to that. And what they want to do is they want to move the whole department, a couple of thousand people, they want to move them to Agile. And, now they're talking to lots of different people, and I went in as one of the options to kind of discuss how to potentially do that. And one of the really interesting things that I try and do when we do stuff like that is figure out how do we transform something that's not just adopting Agile for Agile's sake, but actually achieving something from a business perspective. Probably the best case study about this is not my project, but the best documented case study, how powerful that is Hewlett-Packard's firmware transition that's described in a book on practical large-scale adoption, something. I can find it and send it to you. I think that's an incredibly important book. It was published a year and a half ago, and it started kind of making its way around conferences. They talk about how they've transformed a firmware department, pretty much kind of a no-go for Agile for all these years. They've transformed a printer business that's pretty much kind of not really one of those funky, innovative web businesses that people talk about these days. So it's an area that's completely outside the normal Agile safe zone, and they've transformed it. They've pretty much invented on their own everything that people talk about these days at Agile conferences, and they've done it driven by a very, very clear vision. They said at the moment, we are spending, 70% of our budget just maintaining existing systems. We are spending this, doing that. We're spending 3% doing innovation. That's not sustainable. What we want to do is in 3 years' time, we want to spend this amount of budget on innovation and this amount of budget on maintenance. And driven by that very, very simple idea, they pretty much invented everything that people talk about at Agile conferences on their own. And they were able to resolve all political obstacles. They were able to resolve all the problems people have adopting Agile just because there was a very, very clear business benefit to that. So kind of going into this conversation with the bankers, we went into a room, and one of the managing directors there, when we started talking about what you actually want to achieve, said, I'm ahead of you. I've read some stuff you've written and kind of the whole value thing, and I have an answer for you. I said, okay, that's good. What is the answer? I said, well, last year we have done 35 million pounds of change. Next year, we want to be able to do 70 million pounds of change. Now, this is a bank, and in a bank everything translates to money, which is kind of good and bad at the same time. It's good because it provides real clarity and kind of there's something nice to measure. It's valuable, it's money. And we said, okay, that's a nice target, 70 million pounds of change, so that's double the change. Yeah, okay. And then I've done the stupidest thing in my consulting career. I've put a very senior managing director at a bank into a position where it was clear to everybody he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because I asked him, well, what do you mean by change? What is the 35 million? And then kind of there was a no shit moment where nobody in the room actually knew the answer. And then after about 20 minutes of trying to kind of figure out what that actually means, we realized that that's basically cost. It's salaries and operational costs. That's how much in virtual money the rest of the bank was paying them for implementing software and changing and kind of operating the whole thing. So kind of translated to English, what that basically means is they have spent 35 million pounds last year. This year they want to spend 70 million pounds. And that's how they want to scale Agile. And I said, I have a solution for you. Pay me 35 million, I will walk away, you will never see me again. You don't have to change anything, you can call it scaled Agile. Everybody's going to be happy, success. My wife is going to be ecstatic. And unfortunately, we didn't get that job because they didn't take me seriously. And but that's kind of quite illustrative of how companies approach scaling Agile these days. And I think there's a big, big danger that if all we want to do is spend more money, we'll end up in the fast food chain part of the market, not in delivering kind of something that's really, really great. And that's kind of the big problem. Now, kind of, when most people think about Agile and things like that, I said continuous delivery is a big thing coming. We tend to think about Amazon Prime. We tend to kind of think that our software delivery model is, oh, you know, whenever business people say they want something, we can very quickly package that, we can ship it out, it's great, it's brilliant, it's fantastic, everybody loves us for this. And I kind of mentioned Watercraft earlier, one of the companies that kind of suffered from this factor the most, and I'm not saying kind of most of the people in the audience will have something as drastic as this, but it's an interesting experiment, try it. Kind of these guys, when we went to work with them, they said, well, you know, we do Scrum by the book, and we don't really need anybody's help and things like that. And we got called in to help them kind of figure out how to test the software better, and as kind of the first conversation, people telling us, well, we do Scrum by the book, you know, we don't need the help. It was a bit kind of interesting, especially because I work as a consultant. I don't get called into companies that do well. I generally get called into companies where somebody's really disappointed. And so we started talking to these guys about, you know, what they do and what they mean by Scrum by the book. And kind of they do retrospectives, they do stand-ups, they do blah, blah, blah. Everything's kind of pretty much the same. Now, the really interesting thing here is this company was German, and kind of Germans, you have to love them, they like tracking things. Everything has a number, everything is indexed, everything is kind of put in some database. And because this was a German company, I was pretty sure that we'll find some kind of a requirements tracking system somewhere. And digging in a bit deep, kind of, we found a system that has timestamps for, you know, when was something approved by the business, when it did this, when it did that, when it blah, 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 when it went live. And it was pretty easy to pull out the average time from when something was approved by the business until it went live, and it was about 1.5 years for these guys. So kind of from that perspective, the fact that the team is doing a 2-week iteration inside that is irrelevant. There's 1.5 years around that we need to kind of figure out and optimize. And the other big problem is kind of generally a lot of companies these days, kind of teams are moving a lot faster than the business, and the business people generally do not want to get software every 2 weeks. You go and talk to the call center operators, they're pissed off because their software is changing all the time. You go and talk to kind of support people, they are crazy because they can't find the right manual to kind of find the right update and things like that. So we tend to move at a much faster speed than anybody else. And even when kind of software people start delivering stuff, a lot of it kind of is not actually the Amazon Prime, oh, I want this, you know, I want my new speakers, and they come in an hour. A lot of it is just kind of force feeding people stuff that they don't actually want. The next time your PDF reader asks you for a critical security update in the middle of you reading stuff and say it's important, kind of, you're being force-fed. When something says, oh, we have an important update, for it's not. The stuff that's important for me is the stuff I'm reading at the moment. Updating a security hole in a PDF reader is definitely not that important for me. And the big question is, why was there a security hole in a PDF reader in the first place? But that's kind of a separate discussion. So I think a lot of this whole force-feeding thing has to do with our ability to kind of run faster than the business. And that's why we start inventing our own requirements. That's why we start kind of doing stuff people don't really care about. And the other thing is kind of, there's two popular models for managing larger scale agile work today. One is kind of the whole water scrum fall. And this is where the business people make all the decisions up front, and then you have 7,000 user stories in a backlog that have to be delivered exactly as estimated and things like that. The other model is kind of the whole user story stream of consciousness, where the team is running fast enough for the business people to just kind of randomly throw requirements and shoot it, just throw stuff out and see what's going to happen. And at this point, the users are kind of being force-fed. And we're pushing stuff on that nobody really cares about. We're delivering stuff that people don't really want. And I think this is a part where we can start solving now. Now we have a delivery capacity that's much better than before. This is a part we can actually start solving if we start thinking about kind of creating a wider factory. And the really interesting part of this is that kind of continuous delivery is not just a technical thing. Most people approach it as a technical thing, but it's not. Continuous delivery actually has quite a massive impact on marketing. It has quite a massive impact on marketing because it's allowing people to unlock incredible business opportunities. For example, Tesla, the motor car manufacturer, figured out how to turn continuous delivery into something that breaks away from the normal way of releasing stuff in the car market. All the other car manufacturers have models based on years. You design a car, you manufacture it, you release it, and pretty much that's it. The model you've made is that one. Tesla does over the internet updates of their cars. You might be driving a car, and the car downloads the new version of software while you're driving it and gets some really interesting new features, which opens up a whole set of new risks if there's a bug in that and you're driving it. But it's a really, really interesting market opportunity. It's allowing us to unlock new business models. It's also affecting stuff that is creating entitlement for people where there was no entitlement before that. So a lot of the companies that have moved to a continuous delivery model, truly continuous delivery model, have noticed that their customers have gotten a sense of entitlement that's completely unjustified, which is opening up some really, really interesting problems. For example, going back to Tesla, there was a guy called Richard Wolpert, who a year ago started an online campaign to make Tesla backport all the functionality they have in their new cars to their old hardware. Now, this is a really, really interesting one. What happened is Robert bought a Tesla car a couple of years ago. His neighbor bought a Tesla car that was more recent. And one of those over-the-internet updates was compatible with his neighbor's car and not with his car. And he got pissed off because he figured out he was short-handed. And his neighbor's car looks the same, runs with a slightly different hardware, but has all this new kind of shiny new functionality, and he can't use that anymore. So he started an online campaign to force Tesla to backport their features into an incompatible hardware, which is technically impossible. Now, this is like saying, I bought this Android version 1 phone, and it has a 1 megapixel camera. You have an 8 megapixel phone, and I'm going to start an online campaign to petition somebody to allow me to take 8 megapixel pictures, which is insane. But people are feeling more and more entitled to that because the whole kind of product thing is gone. And this is creating some really, really interesting challenges in terms of what we have to do and how we do marketing of these products, not just a technical thing. And going to a continuous delivery model now has a massive impact on how we plan our marketing campaigns. And not being compatible in those two areas can create really big problems for the business. We did that for the product that we're working on. A couple of friends and I started building this collaboration product 2 years ago, and Pretty much because, hey, we can do this. We've allowed ourselves to deploy multiple times a day, and hey, we do that whenever we can. It's brilliant. Technical works fantastic. It de-risks so much technical stuff, but it has a really, really interesting marketing impact. Because when you start shipping things so frequently, there's never anything so big and so newsworthy to announce. And what we realized is this is our user growth, and at this point here, we announced that we finally released the first proper version out. And there was a big spike. We were on the homepage of Hacker News and Reddit programming for a whole day. So massive spike of people, then dropped off, and slow, word of mouth, word of mouth. This is us open sourcing the whole thing. So there was a news article about that. And this is us being reviewed in Lifehacker when we released the first proper collaboration thing. Pretty much, we've tried to repeat spikes like that, but failed to do that for the next year and a half. The reason why we failed to do that is, as we release stuff multiple times a day and we grow the functionality, there's never anything so newsworthy that any of these news channels is actually going to write about. So, although technically we reduced the risk, we've pretty much killed the best marketing strategy we had. If you look at the effect of everything we've done, getting reviewed in a popular news website had the biggest effect of bringing new users. And so a lot of the stuff that we do technically has a massive impact around us that we don't necessarily consider. And I think in order to be more successful, we need to start bringing the whole marketing thing in and actually figuring out how do we do the stuff that we like doing technically that makes sense to do, like continuous delivery, that's pretty good, de-risks a lot of really good stuff, but actually not cock up a marketing strategy. Or figure out how to do some other marketing strategies that are related to this. Word of mouth tends to be a pretty good thing because when the system is stable and solid and people like it, the user numbers grow, but they grow very, very slowly over time. So this is akin to that Icelandic volcano thing that happened a couple of years ago, and there was a fantastic BBC 9 o'clock news, prime time news thing where they had somebody standing at the airport and saying, oh, the airport has been closed today. As you can see, there's nobody at the airport. There's nothing happening. These doors have not moved for 3 days. That's the definition of not news. There's nothing happening. And you have, the main news channel in the UK and the main news time having to film an empty airport, and the main news is nothing was happening over the last 3 days. So, when we move into a system like that, that's the news that we are able to publish, which has a massive, massive impact on marketing, and people start feeling entitled. So those are some really, really interesting challenges that we start opening up if we start moving to a continuous delivery model, a proper continuous delivery model. And that's why people are scared of that. That's why the water scrum fault thing exists. That's one of the reasons is people can't get their heads around marketing, planning, releasing, figuring out what to do. I've worked with a company last year where they were going to do and they had a pretty good team. They're doing these 2-week releases and things like that. But because their customers have this big deadline that they need to move to a new regulation on a particular date, anything that these guys are producing is pretty much shelved until July this year. So although they're doing Agile, they're doing continuous delivery, technically they're capable of doing stuff, that's pretty much shelved. That's put on some staging system somewhere, and they're still going to have one big bang release that's still going to be massively risky. So I think we're at the point in the industry where we can start resolving those things, but we need to start approaching this thing slightly differently. So one of the first things that we need to do is we need to start decoupling a marketing event and a technical event. We need to start decoupling deployment That's a technical event, a technical thing that allows us to technically de-risk stuff. We want to deploy more frequently. There's a ton of good reasons for that. From a marketing event that's basically releasing software out into the wild. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us as an industry, if we want to really get business people on board, is to truly decouple these two things. For most teams, deployment and release are very tightly coupled. And there's a couple of ways we can start decoupling deployment and release. One of those things are kind of feature flags that people are writing about. There's kind of shadow deployments and a ton of other things, but I think one of the really interesting aspects that's now starting to become possible, that's a technical problem, but by solving that technical problem, we can open up so many business opportunities, is multi-versioning. I think going forward over the next 5 to 10 years, teams that do continuous delivery but don't do proper multi-versioning in production, being able to run multiple versions at the same time, are just kind of not going to get the value out of this. And I think kind of going to a model where we can restructure our software to be able to say, deploy, and then release it to 0.5% of our users, or deploy and then release it to only people in Helsinki, or something like that, and then figure out what's going on and then expand and extend that, is going to allow us to get some really interesting measurements that are valuable and kind of figure that out. So one of the best examples of this is a company called USwitch that I've interviewed for the Spec by Example book. And when I talked to them, what they were doing is pretty much they were moving away from testing too much before deployment, because they said, okay, we de-risk technical stuff before deployment, but what the really interesting information comes only after deployment. And they were able to kind of get their business users with every user story to specify how the business metrics are going to move. And then what they would do is, because they were supporting multi-versioning, they would deploy a new version of the software to 1% of their users and then figure out if the business metrics are going in the right direction or not. If yes, they would keep expanding the release. If not, they would basically take it out. And they were able to get a lot of value, or business value, from their frequent deliveries rather than just kind of deploying stuff technically. There's a fantastic story about this from Google in 2009 that's famous under the name 40 Shades of Blue. This was much before the 50 Shades of Grey, so it's not really related. In 2009, Google's head of design came up with the idea to change the color of the Google Ads hyperlinks. And he pushed that in kind of through the delivery pipeline. The developers, I think, were in a bit of a kind of fight with the designers. And they wanted to prove that this is kind of wrong. So they went and talked and said, well, how do we test that we've done this right? Well, you check the color of the hyperlink. If it's this hex color, it's right. Now, go and do the work. And I said, well, what do we really want to achieve with this? What are you going to measure for success? Why are we doing this? And he said, well, this color is much more noticeable. People will click more on it, will get more money. And then, because Google supports multi-versioning, they were able to prove or disprove that. That night, people have kind of pushed out this change to 1% of the users. They measured that, and they actually measured 40 other shades of blue at the same time. And as a result of that, they had data that proved that the color that the designer chose was performing worse than the current one. And if they expanded it to 100% of the users, if they expanded it to the whole year, the difference would be $250 million. Now, this is a really interesting perspective, because we can talk about, hey, this is successful because, we have achieved this hex color. Or we can talk about, hey, this is successful because we have, made more money or not lost money. And by having the data, basically they went back and they were able to prove to the management this is a bad decision. As a result, the head of design quit. So they saved $250 million plus a salary of an overpaid designer, which is kind of success. So Multi-versioning is one of the most critical things that we can do as software people, because multi-versioning allows us to ridiculously make ridiculously cheaper the kind of act of releasing and decouple deployment from release. We can ship our software out there and we can kind of expose and expand it based on how much marketing people want. We can let them open up really interesting marketing opportunities, or we can let them kind of deal with whatever they need to deal with while still de-risking the whole technical thing. We can still killing the fall part of what a Scrum fall if we do multi-version. Now, multi-version is one of those things where most people in this room, I assume, are now going to think about how this can't possibly work for your situation. But the thing is, it's the same as unit testing 10 years ago. 10 years ago at conferences like this, when people talked about unit testing, most people would say, oh, there's no possible work for our system. But then you realize if the system is actually designed for that, it becomes very, very easy. And over time, as we design new systems, if we design them for multi-versioning in the first place, this thing becomes trivial easy. And kind of the big challenge here is managing data and things like that. But once, there are some good solutions for that. Once that's solved, pretty much we can run multiple versions at the same time. We can shrink, expand. We can do lots of really, really weird things. And this opens up some interesting opportunities. Now, it opens up a really big problem as well. It opens up a problem of how do we know it's actually safe to deploy? If we decouple deployment from release, and safe to release is not our decision, it's a marketing decision, safe to deploy becomes a really, really interesting problem. Because there's no good transparent criteria for what it means to be safe to deploy in most organizations, where kind of there's some random tests there, there's some idea that we need to have, a level of acceptable technical debt and something like that. And this is where some really interesting techniques are opening up. So one thing that we need to start thinking about as a community, if we are going to do this whole kind of multi-versioning thing, is to try and get our teams engaged in creating a really clear criteria for kind of what can we do, when can we deploy, so we don't have to argue about that all the time. And then whenever the criteria is met, we are ready to push out. And this is where I think Google has come up with a really, really interesting technique called the attribute component capability matrix. That's one of those things that is going to be more and more interesting for us as a community to look at in the future. With an attribute component capability matrix, these guys kind of have a shared agreement on risk in the system. The technique is described Google test software by James Whitaker, and this is how they are approaching Android testing and Google Maps testing and things. It scales pretty well. And the idea of that is kind of try and describe the attributes of the system that people feel are important, like fast, secure, whatever this from a marketing perspective, because that's where the risk is. Then kind of describe components of the system that are providing these capabilities, and kind of describe capabilities that those components provide. Like the admin component provides operators the capability of spotting fraudulent transactions. What they realized is that it's impossible to talk about risk and value for a particular technical feature, like how risky is this report? Nobody knows. And then marketing people, if it's not marketing related, ignore it. Accounting people argue that it's priority one, and kind of we always have this kind of Moscow prioritization where everything ends as a must. With an ACC matrix, because they moved the risk discussions to capabilities, what they realized is you can actually create a global picture about risk. And what they show with this is kind of a live picture of how much risk the system carries at the moment. The sum of all capabilities creates a depth of kind of the whole there. And they have a transparent criteria saying that, when there's nothing of risk level, more than something in the system, we are ready to deploy. And this opens up some really, really interesting possibilities. I've worked on stuff like this with a couple of web companies, a couple of banks, where we start an actual transparent discussion on how much risk we're allowed to carry in the system. Because deploying more frequently brings value, but it also brings risk. We should kind of have a clear idea of how much risk we are allowed to carry, where we are allowed to carry risk, and what kind of risk we want to carry. And then once we do that, we can actually just decouple the whole and desubjectivize the whole idea of, hey, can I push it live? So, and then kind of with that kind of stuff, what we can start opening up is some really, really interesting possibilities. And the really interesting possibilities, we can start using frequent delivery as a competitive advantage. If we can then technically de-risk stuff, we push it out. So we've reduced the fall necessity of what is Scrum fall. We can allow people to just go and experiment. The big reason why water Scrum fall exists is it's so expensive to be wrong. That's why people have these big planning meetings, they create long roadmaps, they have lots of plans, and then they have 500 user stories because it's so expensive to be wrong. Now, if we can multi-version stuff and deploy them, allow people to release them as they want, we have made being wrong ridiculously cheap. Because like at Google, hey, let's just try it out on 1%, figure out if this is making anything we want or not, and if so, we do that. If not, hey, we were wrong, and that's not a problem. We just wasted a couple of hours of development, not 6 months. So we can start resolving the water part of water Scrum fall by making the kind of decision evaluation process ridiculously cheap. And this is where kind of, I'll leave you with the final story of how we solved the kind of market problem for that tool. We were working on a milestone that basically talked about doubling the number of active users. And we tried a ton of things, nothing really achieved that big effect. But we got an angry email from a university admin saying, how could you have possibly done this software so stupidly? Okay, let's talk about it. You know, what do you mean? And he said, well, I got 700 emails that I need to click through now, and I need kind of to waste a couple of hours of my life on this. I don't have time for this. So look, our software is not really sending emails, so I have no idea what you're talking about. But, you know, maybe there's a solution for what you need. Tell me what you're doing. And he said, well, I got 800 requests to approve this stupid piece of shit. And one of the things that we've done that is separating us from other tools in the same market is we have really good Google Drive integration. Now, Google Drive for normal people integration works with, you want to save something to Google Drive, a dialog pops up and says, would you like to approve this application to access your Google Drive? You say yes, the dialog goes away, that gets saved. However, in universities, that doesn't work like that. In universities, a student can say yes, but it actually just sends an email to the admin, and the admin has to kind of approve that or disprove that. And kind of this thing that we're building became popular at the university, and kind of the admin got 700 emails. Now, there's a nice checkbox on the app setup page that basically says allow admins to approve it for the entire domain, which is what the university admin was looking for. However, because I've not been in a university for 20 years, I had no idea about that. Now, here's an opportunity that comes completely from the left field, where unknown to anybody who's thinking about the product, we have an angry email from a customer that has an interesting business opportunity, and we ticked a checkbox, and we had to modify a config file. This is all we added, literally all we added. After that, this admin could just approve the whole domain, and not just him. Other admins at other universities could approve the whole domain, and the end result of that is this spike here you see at the end. So pretty much a checkbox and one config setting did more for us than 4 months of development. And we were able to just kind of stop everything else in that milestone and throw all the other user stories away because we achieved what we wanted to achieve with a checkbox. Now, that's competitive advantage with frequent delivery. If we can kind of replan quickly, if we can spot these opportunities, you can push it quickly, then we can turn a checkbox into a business win. And that's kind of the power of doing stuff in an agile way, where with the water scrum fall system, we'd probably kind of just keep going on for another 3 months, release all the user stories and say, hey, we succeeded, and the number of users would still probably be somewhere over there. And the email that we got with the kind of checkbox would say, oh, that's a nice idea, but sorry, we have too much work anyway. So kind of, that's the thing that we need to start doing. So there's a really, really important thing to do about that is to start creating hierarchical backlogs, move away from linear backlogs and kind of start positioning value and what we want to achieve as an outcome and measuring that kind of stuff. And in order to do that, kind of what we need to start doing is, first of all, make that measurement ridiculously cheap, which means multi-versioning. And in order to kind of unlock the whole multi-versioning thing, we need to start decoupling deployment from release. So that's what I'll leave you with. Those are kind of the two thoughts that I wanted to put into your heads. And hopefully I've inspired you to kind of investigate how to restructure your system so that you can do multi-versioning a bit better. Because that's allowing us to transform technical problems into a business opportunity, rather than what a lot of people do now, transforming kind of a technical solution into a business problem where we force feed users with what they don't want to have. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a really good day, and I hope I've inspired you to at least kind of try out some of these things. Thank you.